Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 508, The Culture of Classical Japan, Part 2. When we talk about Classical Japan, in other words, the Heian period, named after the imperial capital and running from 749 to 1185 CE, really the first thing that tends to come to mind is literature. The classical canon of Japanese literature does, of course, run a bit further back than the Heian era. The poems of the Manyoshu and the mytho-histories like the Kojiki predate it, but the works of Heian Japan are generally more widely read and better regarded today. In many ways, that is because they are more accessible. As we discussed last week, the Japanese language had begun to evolve into something that's at least recognizably related to modern Japanese by the early Heian period. If you want to read the Manyoshu, you'll have to read it in translation even if you are a native Japanese speaker. The Manyogana hybrid writing system is just impenetrable unless you study it academically, to the point where it might as well be a different language. By comparison, the classical Japanese of the Heian era is certainly very different from modern Japanese, but it's at least more accessible than Manyogana, which, again, without alteration, is just incomprehensible even for a native speaker. But to be honest, I do not think language is the only reason for the enduring popularity of the Heian canon, and I'm not alone in that opinion. For centuries now, the literature of the Heian period has been held up as the time when a distinctly Japanese worldview began to emerge in writing, whatever exactly you think that means. And indeed, later Japanese nationalists would point to the classic works of this period, and especially to their emphasis on aesthetics and on worldly impermanence, as examples of what makes Japanese culture itself distinctive. Of course, this makes the subject of Heian literature of some importance to us here, and we're going to try and do a survey of that subject today, though I want to say up front, this is going to be very far from a comprehensive episode. Instead, it is going to focus on introducing major themes and ideas which you can investigate further if you are so inclined. So, all that said, first things first, what conditions are these famous works emerging from? Well, the first thing to understand about classical Japanese literature is that it often bridges what we think of as a pretty stark divide between prose and poetry. In English, these are distinct forms of writing. In Japanese, both classical and modern, there is a good amount of overlap. Poems are often accompanied by narrative prose, describing the conditions under which they're being composed, because the terse and often referential nature of the poem itself might not otherwise be clear, and prose is often interspersed with poetry, the ability to compose poems being one of the markers of education and good culture for a member of the nobility during this time. As we mentioned last week, poetry has a long history in Japan going back to the earliest moments of recorded history. And the general pattern of the Japanese state during this time, as we've seen pretty much since this series has started, was to model itself off designs taken from imperial China, and in the social and cultural realm, things were no different. However, after the first century of the Heian era, the nature of popular poetry began to shift. For the previous few centuries, broadly, there had been something of a genre divide between what were called kanshi, styles of poetry written in Chinese and based on the model of Chinese poets, and waka, or Japanese language poems. The precise genre differences are, to be honest, a bit arcane unless you are very into poetry as a subject. For us, the most important thing is the different languages used in these different styles of poetry. By the late Nara and early Heian periods, kanji, or Chinese-style poems, had come to dominate public spaces. Kanji poets were the ones who received support from the government and whose works were published in official anthologies, and kanji was generally held up in public as the more sophisticated narrative form. There are a few reasons why this was the case, though by far the biggest was the fact that, since the business of state was conducted in Chinese at this point, an educated man had to be able to read and write that language, and writing kanji was a great way to demonstrate that talent and demonstrate your ability to live up to the standards of cultured gentlemanliness established by the great dynasties of the continent. Waka poems in Japanese were still composed, but not celebrated publicly. The fact that they were often written in the emerging hiragana, the phonetic syllabary, rather than in Chinese characters, meant they were often caricatured as lacking sophistication or refinement. Waka poems were also written primarily by aristocratic women during this period, who generally were not educated in Chinese since that was the language of government, but who could read and write Japanese using hiragana. And because of its association with femininity, Waka poetry was not taken as seriously. By the 800s CE, Waka poems were often confined to private correspondence, composed as part of an exchange of letters or attached to a social invitation. As the later great Waka poet Kino Tsurayuki put it, Waka poems of the time were, quote, nothing but empty verses and empty words, and the province of the amorous. In other words, they were mostly good for dumb jokes or hitting on people. Of course, that didn't last, though fortunately for those of us with cheap senses of humor, the dumb jokes would never go away entirely. Still, the poetic winds did begin to shift in the late 800s, as there was a revival of interest among Japan's elite in waka as a distinctive form. There are a few reasons for this shift. For a start, as China's Tang dynasty began to weaken and falter, the prestige of imitating continental styles waned with it. Over the course of the Heian period, government positions also became increasingly a matter of inheritance from one's parents rather than merit and hard work, meaning there was less of an incentive for the children of the elite to exert themselves in learning Chinese if they were not of a scholarly bent. Perhaps the single biggest incentive, however, was the growing cultural power of women, who suddenly found themselves in the middle of politics. As we covered 2 weeks ago, one of the main ways the northern Fujiwara family came to dominate the government was through marriage alliances with emperors, who they could then reduce to figureheads, governing themselves as the appointed regents. And one of the main ways said regents controlled the emperors was via marriage to Fujiwara women, who in turn would also give birth to new imperial heirs. And this meant that the ability of said women to be charming, in part by showing off poetic skill and refinement, was suddenly not a frivolous matter, but a matter of extreme political importance. That kind of talent could draw an emperor's eye and ensure the power of the family, and of course the prestige of the woman lucky enough to give birth to a potential heir. And so over the last few decades of the 800s, waka began to shake the perception that it was a frivolous form. Instead, it returned to the limelight where it would remain in style going forward. The composition of Chinese-style poems did not stop, of course, but it was no longer as prominent in the public literary world as it had been. Still, it took a while for waka to re-enter the world of respectable literature, so to speak. The best example of this is one of the earliest classic works of Heian literature, Ise Monogatari, ascribed to an aristocrat of imperial ancestry named Ariwara no Narihira. We have covered Ariwara and Ise Monogatari in substantial depth back in episode 446, so I will not retread that ground completely here. But there are a few aspects of Ariwara's literary career that are important to an overview of the literary trends of classical Japan. First, Ariwara himself was both a descendant of and a political friend to several factions within the aristocratic world and the imperial family opposed to the power of the northern Fujiwara clan. And given how the northern Fujiwara were able to more or less take control of the government starting in the 850s, This was obviously not a great political position to be in, and by the later part of the century, Ariwara and his allies found themselves more or less totally on the political outs. And many of these men, including Ariwara, responded to being bounced from public life by retiring into private life, building what were, in essence, social circles around powerful aristocrats or imperial supporters. In Ariwara's case, he fell in with a group of literarily inclined aristocrats who were part of a literary salon that would meet in the home of Prince Koretaka, a prince of the imperial family who once upon a time had ambitions of being seated upon the throne, but who had been denied that chance by the northern Fujiwara, who had instead placed a prince related to them on the imperial seat. Now, like the literary salons of European history, ostensibly these were social gatherings to have high-minded erudite discussions about important things among friends. Of course, they were also an excuse to get drunk together and enjoy life, or at least commiserate about those damn Fujiwara bastards. It was during his time as a part of Prince Koretaka's salon that Ariwara's compositions, what became Issei Monogatari, came together, almost certainly a compilation based on his own private collection of writings and diaries, which are, unfortunately, lost to us. And this early classic of waka poetry did not, unfortunately, shake the genre's reputation as being nothing but a thinly veiled format for sexual escapades. The earliest chapters of Issei Monogatari, the ones most likely to have been written by Ariwara himself, are pretty much just describing his amorous encounters, which might have been based on real experiences, but there's no way to be sure, followed by some admittedly well-written poetry about those encounters. It was only after Ariwara's death in 880 that future writers added later chapters to the text, where the main character grapples with more erudite themes around the impermanence of such worldly pleasures, an attempt, put crudely, to class up the original text a bit. It would not be for a few more decades yet that waka would attain prominence as a literary form, driven by one of the most famous poets in Japanese history, about whom we talked a little bit last week, Ki no Tsurayuki. We know very little of Ki no Tsurayuki's life or career. He probably got his start as part of one of these literary salons, possibly the very same one Ariwara no Narihira came up in. He was from a minor family, politically speaking, and never made it far up the political ladder. His highest-ranking posting was as a provincial governor, not bad, but to one of the most remote parts of the country, Tosa Province, now Kochi Prefecture on Shikoku's Pacific coast, a place famous primarily as a destination to exile criminals. His talent for poetry is probably what allowed him to climb as high as he did. Being involved with these salons was a great way to come to the attention of those with power and influence, and accelerate your career beyond what otherwise would have been possible for a man from only a minor family background. However, Ki no Tsurayuki's poetic contributions are far better regarded than his political ones. As we discussed last week, he was the chief editor of the Kokin Wakashu, or Kokinshu for short, a collection of Japanese poems from ancient and modern times, roughly translated. This was the first government-sponsored collection of waka poetry, and Ki no Tsurayuki's editorship of it would have a massive influence on how this genre of poetry was evaluated going forward. He was not, to be clear, solely responsible for the restoration of waka poetry to prominence, or for giving it a role outside of bawdy jokes. For decades now, waka poetry had been rising in popularity, for all the reasons we've discussed. Where once a major occasion in the life of an emperor would have been commemorated with a Chinese-style kanshi poem, now waka were the go-to. And where once men of poetic talent had shown off their skills in competitions using Chinese poems, now uta awase, or poetry contests for waka, were far more common. But Ki no Tsurayuki's collection of poems in the Kokinshu, and his Japanese-language preface to the text explaining his views on what made for a good poem, did prove very influential. Also, he did write 102 of the over 1,000 poems in the collection, by far the most of any one single author, which helps his legacy quite a bit, but I have to admit also kinda feels like cheating given that he did edit the thing. Anyway, Ki no Tsurayuki's preface is probably the most important part of the work. It begins with a valorization of Japanese poetry as a medium, noting that, quote, "It is poetry which, without effort, moves heaven and earth, stirs the feelings of the invisible gods and spirits, smooths the relations of men and women, and calms the hearts of fierce warriors," unquote, before moving into a critique of the poetry of the time as insipid nonsense that ignores the heart of the genre. This section includes some dunks on other poets by name who he did not care for, including Ariwara no Narihira, whose poems, quote, "are like withered flowers, faded but with a lingering fragrance." After engaging in petty smack talk, Tsurayuki turns towards a theory of Japanese poetry as having three basic components. The first two are kokoro, or spirit, and kotoba, words. Roughly, these would be having a clear theme and having a clear subject, and I am simplifying a lot here. If you're curious for more detail about these elements, check out episode 447. The final element is sama, roughly form or style. This is basically imitating the formal demands of Chinese poetry, with its focus on clever references, wit, and oblique discussion of the subject matter, rather than making the poem too obvious or clear in its message. The focus is on producing an elegant confusion in the reader as they grapple with the meaning of the poem, and on provoking a certain mental state or response in a reader rather than aiming to be realistic in how a scene is portrayed. Overall, the notion is to balance intellectual and rational approaches with emotional ones when appreciating a work of poetry, creating a holistic human experience via engagement with the form. And this idea would more or less come to define what waka poems were going forward. The Kokinshu was one of 7 government-sponsored poetry compendia created over the course of the Heian period. If you're curious, we have first the Kokinshu from 905, then the Gosenshu, or later collection, from 951, then the Shuishu, or collection of gleanings, from 1006, then the Golshuishu, or later collection of gleanings, from 1087, then the Kinyoshu, or collection of golden leaves, from 1126, then the Shikashu, or collection of verbal flowers, from 1151, and then finally the Senzaishu, or collection of 1,000 years, from 1188. And of all of these, the Kokinshu is by far the best known, and while other collections would occasionally try to mix up the formula he created, Tsurayuki's approach to waka would remain the definitive one for centuries going forward. Future poetic masters, most notably the great Fujiwara no Teika, would hold up Kokinshu and Kino Tsurayuki as the guy, the one who had figured out what Japanese poetry should be, and going forward the composition of waka would be about building on, or less charitably simply trying to replicate, the notions of poetic brilliance Kino Tsurayuki defined. Of course, poetry was not the only field of Heian literary accomplishment, and here we must turn our attention to the world of prose. But that doesn't mean we leave poetry behind. We've already talked, of course, about Ise Monogatari, which blended the two forms to give some context to the amorous poems of Ariwara no Narihira. But there's one key difference between poetry and prose in the Heian tradition. Most of the famous works of prose, including perhaps 2 of the most famous texts in Japanese history, were written not by men, but by women. Helen Craig McCullough makes an excellent point as to why, in her essay on the Heian court and art, quote, "There were in effect 2 kinds of literature at the Heian court: poetry, which was the recognized public genre, suitable for both masculine and feminine attention, and narrative prose, which was largely relegated to the rear palace where the women resided. The imperial ladies thus presided over the only universal literary centers of the day, embracing both poetry and prose in their interest and encouraging literary activity both indirectly by setting a prestigious example, and directly by patronizing individual writers." In other words, because poetry was considered to be a public genre, both men and women wrote it, but prose was not, and therefore largely confined to women. This development took some time, and indeed, alongside Ise Monogatari, the other early work of Heian prose was Tosa Nikki, the Tosa Diary, written by none other than Kino Tsurayuki and describing a return journey from Tosa province, where he was the governor, back to Kyoto. Tosaniki, however, is still revealing of the shifting trend because it is a semi-fictionalized account that Tsurayuki wrote not from his own perspective, but from the perspective of a fictional woman. Why? Well, he didn't explain his reasoning, but we have a few guesses. For a start, Nikki, or diaries, had up until this point, as a genre, referred to official day-to-day accounts written by men in Chinese, and they often made, frankly, for pretty dry reading. Much of the content was just, on day X the weather was Y, and so did Z. Tosaniki is of course not that. The protagonist starts off by saying she is ignorant of Chinese styles and conventions, and the whole text is written in Japanese, using the phonetic alphabet associated still at this point primarily with women. The content is also way more expressive, way more psychological than just some dry recounting of the nature of the trip. So what's probably going on here is some kind of literary experiment where Kino Tsurayuki is creating imaginary conditions where he feels it would be appropriate to compose a diary in Japanese, and in this context using Japanese literary conventions instead of Chinese ones, just to see what would happen. And this has made Tosaniki something of a touchstone in terms of conversation around gender and language in Heian Japan. It comes up in pretty much every discussion around the evolution of the written Japanese language for a start. It's also very influential on later writers. Tosaniki, though it was ostensibly a private diary, was clearly intended to be circulated so that Kino Tsurayuki could, in the time-honored manner of male writers everywhere, show off how good he was at writing women, and in that process, he helped pioneer the idea that diaries could be literature. And going forward, quite a few women would write literary diaries that were very highly regarded. Three of my personal favorites are the Kagero Nikki, or Gossamer Diary, composed sometime in the 980s, the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, or Izumi Shikibu's Diary, composed around the year 1000, and the Sarashina Nikki, or Diary of Lady Sarashina, from sometime around 1060. And all three of these, of course, have episodes associated with them in the back catalog if you are curious. Izumi Shikibu and the Diary of Lady Sarashina were part of episodes 296 and 97, and Kagero Nikki and its author were the subject of episode 383. There is, of course, a lot that could be said about any of these works, all of which are quite interesting, and in particular, as I've said before on this podcast, the Sarashina Nikki connected with me in a pretty powerful way back when I was taking some of my very first Japan-related coursework in undergrad. But there's really no way we could recount any of them meaningfully here, especially since I want to make room to talk about the two literary titans in the room, so I'm just going to note a few of the key features of these works. First, we know very little about the authors themselves. Indeed, for Kagero Nikki and Sarashina Nikki, we don't even know the name of the authors in question. The Kagero Nikki author is known as the mother of Fujiwara no Michitsuna, and the Sarashina Nikki author as the daughter of Sugawara no Takasue. This is a result of cultural norms imported from where else but Imperial China, where women's roles were considered primarily domestic, and so something as intimate as a name was not to be shared outside the home. This in turn meant that women's names were not usually recorded in public-facing genealogies, such as the sorts used to prove membership in a noble family, and thus those names are often lost to time. Even in the case of Izumi Shikibu, that's not really a name. Izumi is the name of the province her husband was a governor of, and Shikibu, or Master of Ceremonies, was the highest position attained by her father. Izumi Shikibu is thus a kind of public-facing pen name, clearly intended to reference who she is, without violating norms around female propriety. Second, all of these works were intended, from what we can tell, to be public-facing, despite the use of the word diary. In this case, the diaries in question were intended to be public literature, rather than a private record or confessional. The nature of the diary genre is complex, and more than we can get into here, but particularly by the mid to late Heian years, it was clear these works were being written with the notion someone would see them, and they were a chance to demonstrate literary talent. Third, all of these works are unified by themes that might be called religious, derived from Buddhism, notions especially of worldly impermanence, and of one of the most important terms in the history of Japanese literature, mono no aware. This term is usually rendered in English as the impermanence of things. It's a bit of an anachronism to use it here because it was not coined until several centuries later by early Japanese nationalists looking back at the Heian past to discover what they thought was the true essence, or at least a truer essence, of Japanese identity. These thinkers identified mono no aware as a sort of psychological awareness that everything in the world is ultimately impermanent and will fade away, and a wistful sadness at that thought, combined with an exaltation at the very impermanence of the thing itself, which was what, after all, gave the world meaning. Helen Craig McCullough's rough definition of the term was, quote, a deep but controlled emotional sensitivity, especially to beauty and to the tyranny of time. The idea of mono no aware has, ever since these early nationalists coined it, been almost synonymous with the literature of the Heian period. Indeed, it's sometimes emphasized to the point of being kind of reductive, but still it's hard to ignore the presence of this notion in period literature. And of course, it's all the more evident in probably the single most famous text of the entire period, the Genji Monogatari, or Tale of Genji, ascribed to Murasaki Shikibu. And by the way, once again, that's a pen name. Murasaki is a title given to her for reasons that are contested, while Shikibu simply refers to the fact that, much like Izumi Shikibu, her father worked as a master of ceremonies within the imperial court. She herself was a Fujiwara, and there's even been some research suggesting we can uncover her personal name, but that's not what most people know her as, so I'm not going to cover it here. Anyway, the Tale of Genji is far and away the most famous of another genre of Heian literature that was in its day very dominant, the long-form romance, a genre that was apparently particularly popular with aristocratic women, who both could read the texts, which were written primarily in hiragana, and were barred from public life, meaning they had a lot of time during the day to fill. The famous writer Sei Shonagon, about whom we will talk more in a second, described romances as the best cures, alongside Go and backgammon, for boredom. And Takasue's daughter, the author of the Sarashina Nikki, described romances like Genji as so popular that despite the hundreds of copies in circulation among the women of the capital, they were generally very difficult to get a hold of. As for what makes Genji specifically special, once again I will turn to McCullough to talk about why it stands out, because I think she puts it very well. Quote, Murasaki echoes the concerns of and adopts some of the techniques of the Waka poet, developing two major themes, the tyranny of time and the inescapable sorrow of romantic love, within the context of man's relationship to nature. But whereas the poet seeks to distill mono no aware into the briefest of lyrical expressions, Murasaki uses both poetry and prose to explore the concept in evocative, leisurely detail, weaving a fabric of infinite richness and complexity. Whereas the anthology poet avoids indecorous personalism, Murasaki fills her stage with more than 500 characters, each a recognizable individual, and makes her long story develop logically from their thoughts and feelings, and from the interplay of their personalities. The core plot of the Tale of Genji revolves around Prince Genji, an offshoot of the imperial clan pining with love for one of the emperor's concubines, the Lady Fujitsubo, and dealing with a less than ideal marriage to his own wife, the Lady Aoi. As a result, he busily sets out having affairs across the capital, with much of the text being consumed by the various recountings of his amorous entanglements with women, and with at least one boy. The narrative is largely episodic. It's fairly likely Murasaki wrote the early chapters either just before or after the untimely death of her husband, rose to prominence because of them, and then began to receive sponsorship to finish the rest. Specifically, she was taken in as a lady-in-waiting to Empress Shoshi, one of two rival primary wives to Emperor Ichijo. With Shoshi's sponsorship, she continued to work on the text, finishing it by 1021, when Takasue's daughter referenced a completed manuscript in her diary. Genji Monogatari is often held up not just as a classic of Japanese literature, but of world literature, and in its heyday, it was widely circulated both as a manuscript and an emaki, a version with illustrations of the various scenes. There is, of course, a lot more to say about Genji, but I do also have to note here that, as longtime listeners know, I'm not a huge fan of this particular text. No shade to those that are. The episodic style is just not my thing, and it has fierce competition from my absolute favorite author from this period. And she is, of course, Sei Shonagon, also a pseudonym, Sei coming from a character in her father's last name, Shonagon being the Japanese name of the government rank of junior counselor, though it's unclear why this moniker was attached to her, as neither her father nor her husband ever served as Shonagon. Sei Shonagon was also a lady-in-waiting to Empress Teishi, who was the other primary wife of Emperor Ichijo, creating something of a rivalry between Teishi and Shoshi, and between their various retinues, including Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon. This is partially why our episodes on Murasaki and Sei Shonagon are back-to-back in the catalog, episodes 270 and 271 specifically, so that, as in life, so in death, they can rival one another. Sei Shonagon is, of course, best known for the Makura no Soshi, often translated as the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, that name being a reference to the text serving like a diary, kept by one's bed to record your thoughts. Still, the Makura no Soshi is emphatically not a diary. It belongs to a distinctly Japanese and, in many ways, distinctly Heian genre called zuihitsu. Literally meaning a wandering brush, zuihitsu are not intended to provide a narrative of one's life in the style of a diary. Instead, the goal is to record amusing or interesting anecdotes, shorter stories, or just interesting shower thoughts, to use a modern turn of phrase. Honestly, the best way to think of it is probably like a series of social media posts, rather than a coherent narrative. The text got its start because Sei Shonagon was gifted some paper by Empress Teishi, paper being a luxury item since it had to be hand-produced, but the commissioning of a new manuscript of one of the Chinese classics, Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, meant there was some extra lying about the imperial palace. Teishi gifted Sei Shonagon this paper, and she used it to begin composing her musings, supposedly just for herself. She was, she claimed, very upset that she just so happened to leave her writing out in plain view in her home while away on a trip, and that friends of hers just so happened to come by and find it lying there, and just so happened to read it and find it funny, and take it with them to read more and read with other people, and oh no, woe is me, my secret work is out there. Obviously, the text was always meant for public consumption. Sei Shonagon denies it in her work, but it was clearly a way for her to show off what a witty and clever person she was. And I have to admit, it worked. I find Makura no Soshi very fun, from her anecdotes about a one-night stand, ending with annoyance at her lover taking too long to get dressed and beat it, to her advice to religious orders that they hire hot priests so that people will pay attention to what the priests say, to the things she finds annoying in men. Quote, a man you've had to conceal in some unsatisfactory hiding place who then begins to snore, a man who has nothing in particular to recommend him, discussing all sorts of subjects at random, as though he knew everything. Being unsophisticated, I find this sort of humor easy to connect with, and that explains really why I prefer Makura no Soshi among all the Heian classics. It does help also that the anecdotal style means the narrative is not as long or complicated as, say, Genji, and thus easier to follow. All of this is, of course, a brief sampling of the classics of Heian literature, and it is far from comprehensive. As I've said, each text we've talked about either could be or already is an episode all its own, and even those don't really do justice to all you could get from these works. That said, I hope the overview of the literature proved worthwhile. I think it does tell us a lot about the period in general. The importance of public perception as a part of your literary persona, be it writing poems or dunking on your lovers, the fusion of fashionable Buddhist notions into the literary scene, and of course the central role of women in creating what came to be defined as the classical Japanese corpus of literature. By far my favorite thing about Heian period literature, though, is how alive all of it feels. You can read something like Makar no Soshi or the Sarashina or Kagero Nikki and get a sense of the personality of the life of a person who lived 1,000 years ago. How cool is that? Next week, it's back to politics, but I hope you enjoyed our foray into the world of cultural history. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesa podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Special thanks also to new donor to the History of Japan Patreon, Brody, for supporting the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you all next week for the Rise of the Samurai.